pretty common question is how to change your own tires. This is how I do it, but it's not the hardest thing to do. It isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do, but it is entirely doable in your own garage with just a few tools once you get the tire and rim off the bike. For this, we're just going to be changing the tube in this because the tire is actually perfectly fine. So we have a replacement tube. This is tire lube. You can buy it at auto parts stores. You can use Windex or something like that. Conditioner actually works pretty well. And then we have 3 tire irons here. Having 3 is super handy. These super long ones, they're 24 inches from Harbor Freight. They work really well, but they're not the most easy thing to carry around if you're gonna have it in like a toolkit. This little short one does work. It just requires more effort if you have a batch of these. And then that right there is a valve core removal tool. You do need that to get the valve core out of the inside of this, just because that's what it's designed to do. But I have another camera set up and I'll show you how I do it. So the first step is to remove the valve core. I just did. That lets all the air out of the tube or the tire if it's tubeless. And then you have to break the bead on both sides. So top and bottom. With this, I'm just going to be using these irons just to show you how it can be done with just tire irons. They do make a nice little tool, and I'll show you later. It works really, really well for breaking motorcycle beads. If you're working on big fat tires, kind of like that one there, or some of those really big cruiser tires, having that bead breaking tool works phenomenally well. These can be done with just tire irons, but to do this, you're just going to insert the hooked end of the tire iron between the tire and the rim and kind of wiggle it in there. Now you do want to be careful not to scratch the outside. You will scratch the inside of the rim a little bit. You also don't want to scratch the landing where the bead sets in here. I'll show you what it looks like once we get the tire off. You probably will scratch it a little bit, but you just don't want to be getting some heavy gouges in there. But so I have the hook hooked in, and I'm just going to push down. And that starts to drop the bead in a little bit. You can see it's creating some space. Now the next step, and this is going to be kind of hard to do one-handed, is to insert the other iron, and nice work, Matthew, inside here. You got to kind of like work them a little bit so that they both kind of stack on top of each other, and I'll show you that in just a second because I cannot do this one-handed. There, just like that. So they're just stacked on top of each other, and then you just do the same thing. You just gotta push it back down, and all we're trying to do is get that bead to sink. Now you're not gonna be able to do this in just one spot, so you have to do this like around at least like probably a third of the tire. So we're gonna work this way. Next set, I'm gonna do about this far. So it's like, I don't know, 3-4 inches across. And then it's the same thing. Push down in here, let it sink a little bit, pull the irons out, insert them back underneath, do the same thing, push down, and you're just slowly working that bead around all the way around the rim. By the time I get to like over here, I'm betting the bead on this side is gonna drop, and you can really just push with your hand or your feet and sink the rest of the bead on this side. And then we gotta flip the tire over and do the same thing. I'll just show you what it's looking like so far. I started here, I've been working my way up along the rim, and you can see there's a nice gap forming right here. Now I just have one iron preset right there, and I'm betting it's gonna drop in just a second. Let's see if I can do this one-handed. I'm just counterbalancing with my knees on the other side to keep the rim from flopping around. I'm just gonna push down here, and there it goes. You can see, you know, it's dropped down because the tire creates a bigger gap going forward to the direction that you were working. So now we can just push, maybe. Oh, okay, maybe not. We'll use the iron for this. And we just sink it the rest of the way down. Now, if you're finding that it's really, really hard to get that bead to drop or anything like that, like you've worked your way all the way around the tire and it's hardly moving, it can be helpful to use some tire lube or glass cleaner or anything like that. Spray it all the way around the tire and it'll start to work its way in, and it makes it slippery, so it's going to start to move around a lot better, and you might have to work your way around again. But after you do that, eventually that bead will fall. So the other side's done. Now we do this side. And it's the same thing. So I'm just pushing down on the iron, holding the other side of the wheel, and that will make it so I don't tip the whole thing over. Now for this, just working it in. They're both stacked on top of each other. I'm pinching them together so they don't kind of pull apart, and push. Okay, so that's number one. Again, I'm only working, I don't know, probably like 4, 5, 6 inches apart from the last space, and pushing. There it goes. That side went pretty easily. And just work it all the way around. Oh, that's a stiff tire. All right, so both sides have now been broken free. The bead is into the drop center, so there's like basically this space right here is considered the drop center. So there's a gap all the way around. Now what we have to do is use our irons again. I'm gonna go in and hook, and then you gotta pull it around the outside of the rim. Now this one does have some scratches from the last attempts or last time this was changed. It is best if you don't scratch them. If they're your own and you don't worry too much about it, then I guess you can scratch it. For this, we will be using all 3 of our irons. So the 2 big ones are providing the most leverage, and then this little one is really there to just kind of help hold the bead where you want it. So it's just kind of like a bead lock, or not a bead lock, it's like a bead buddy in a sense. It is more useful on installation than it is on taking it apart or taking the tire off the rim, but I might not even actually use this to take it off. When I go to put it back on, you'll see that I'll use this little tire iron. It is just what, a 10-inch. I'll be using that to kind of like lock the bead where I want it to be while I work the tire the rest of the way around. And that's just when I'm putting it back on. Now when I'm doing this, I like to work on the opposite side of me. So I work on the outside basically. And you just work the rim, the tire iron. Now this has, for motorcycle tires, you're pretty much only going to use the hooked end and not like the straight end of the iron. For this, you want the hooked end to be basically like pointing towards the inside of the tire, so it's catching that bead. So you just kind of work it in, and you'll feel it when it drops in. Now this is a tube tire, and if I was trying to save the tube, I'd be a little bit more careful. This is, the tube was damaged last time it was installed, so I'm replacing it for somebody, and I'm not too worried about the tube that's in the tire. When I go to put the new tube in, then that's going to be a lot more careful, because I don't want to pop that tube. So all I'm doing right now, I got the hook end on the bead of the tire. For this, if you just pry it up, you'll see it's starting to kind of come up, but it will get really, really stiff. So you kind of want to work the opposite side of the tire down, and this creates a bit more space. And it's pushing this bead on the backside, so where my knees are, it's pushing it further into that drop center and giving this bead on the opposite side more space to come out and around. So you just kind of keep going like that, and eventually you're gonna get it so you can get your first iron down against like the hub, or try to avoid hitting the rotor and stuff like that, but you get it most of the way over. And I take my second one. Now you might find it's really, really hard to get into like the next available space, and I like to work again pretty much the same. I work to my right about 4, 5, 6 inches apart, especially in the very beginning, because you're working little bits of this tire around. You got to slowly bring it around the rim before you start taking like bigger bites of the bead. So for this, to get that second iron in, I'm actually going to release the bead off this side get my second iron in and hooked, and then I start to swing my first iron down, and when I'm like 3/4 of the way, or have a good, like it's starting to, you can feel some tension easing up on it, I start with the other one. And so they both kind of come down together. Now from here, if I had another big one, I'd sink it in here and leave this first one there. Because I don't, I'm actually gonna release this first one, maybe. Is it gonna work for me? It might work. Holding the one iron down so that it still has the hook, I just have to work this other iron into the beads. Maybe. There it is. And then now that it's a little relaxed, I can just slowly work each iron around. Again, I'm trying not to scratch this up anymore, so I'm just being really careful with the iron so they don't scratch this. This is pretty much just brushed aluminum, not aluminum. It's pretty much like brushed steel, so I don't want to add any more scratches to it if I can help it. So if you're having trouble like getting the tip of that hook in, kind of like push down a little bit from the back of the, like push down with like the hand closest to the bead. The other hand is like you're using for the leverage. So you just kind of like lift and push. And you're just working it between the rim and that tire. Maybe. You know what? Let's go right here. Alright. And just slow and easy. It's not super diff. You don't have to go super quick with this. There's the next one. Once you get like 1/3 of the way around again, it's gonna get really easy because there's just more space for that to hook in. So I'm just releasing the valve stem screw or the nut that's holding it in. Tube tires will have these, tubeless do not. And then I push the valve stem back through. And then from the opposite side of the valve stem, I grab the tube from inside. And just pull it all the way back. And again, that tube itself is bad. So it's been pinched when they installed it. If I was just replacing the tube and not doing a video on how to change a tire, I could actually kind of sneak it back in without taking the tire all the way off, but I'm going to show you the whole process. So for this, I'm going to rotate it around. So the valve stem to the tube is right in front of me. And the process is pretty much the same from here. The only difference to get the second bead off is you might have to lift up one side, like the back side of the tire, get your iron inside, and then you gotta go all the way down to catch that second bead. Now, for getting that second bead out, it can be a little bit weird because you're working in like a kind of a tighter space right here. So I just kind of pull up a little bit with the first iron, second iron, fish it in there. And again, it's usually like a 1-2 movement. So I start moving the first iron, and then as it's coming down, I bring the second iron with it. Now I will use this little one just to kind of lock this bead up where it is. So to show you a close-up of how I use like the second iron as kind of like the third iron, sorry, as a lock. This is the first iron I put in. This is the second iron I put in. You can see that little iron is now kind of like underneath the bead right there, and then underneath the second iron. So that second tire iron is keeping that little one where it needs to be. If you had some rope or anything like that, you could like tie it to a spoke if you wanted to. Sometimes you can hook it underneath like the rotor. It's not providing a lot of like back tension, so I don't worry too much about that. But this will allow me to remove that first iron, move it over here, and that will kind of help keep that'll help keep that bead gap where it's supposed to be. There you can see I've worked it a little bit further. Now I'm still pinching this little iron where I originally put it, so it's still in the same exact spot. And all I do is just, once I get this like iron that was gonna hold it all the way flat, I just kind of rotate it over so it's gonna catch and hold that little iron. So to do the next one, I'm gonna spin this one over like that and then pull this one out and move it further over here. And again, I'm just working that bead all the way around. And to catch that bead on this side, I'm really only working in, what is that, 4 inches? Like 4-inch bites. And that just allows you to slowly walk it around. So, right now I'm all the way up to the valve stem. So I'm gonna come back to this side now. And with this one, the tire is probably gonna basically pop right off. So there it is. So it just took a little effort to get that one out of there, and now the tire is like kind of less than half onto the rim. So you can actually remove the little one, and I can pull out all my other irons gently. Easy, easy. There it is. And then you can pretty much just pry them apart just like that. So once you get them pried apart, we have our tire, which typically you're replacing the tire and the tube at the same time. Again, I'm just replacing the tube. This is our rim. So right here, these two flats, these are where your beads set, and this is actually where your beads seal on a tubeless tire. So you do want to be really careful with that on a tubeless tire because that is the sealing surface. Down in here, so this space right here where my 3 fingers are, that's the drop center. You can see it right here, how it's like lower than the two sides, like the bead lands. If you do have a spoke tire, it might have this like rubber band all the way around it. And all that's really to do is to protect the tube itself from getting like punctured by like the spoke nipples. So they're just right here. You can kind of see where they are. If that's in really, really, really bad shape, it's worth replacing. This one's in really good shape. I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can tell when they wear out because like the tops, you can feel where the bead nipple is. If that's really, really rough or it's already kind of worn out a little bit, it's a good time to change it, because if it's wearing through that, it's gonna wear through your tube and you'll be doing this again in no time. So with the new tube, to get it ready to put in, I'm actually gonna put it in the wheel, or not the wheel, the tire, and then inflate it so it kind of like shapes itself to the inside of this tire, and then I'll let the air all the way back out. So I de-inflate it, but what it does is it gets it out of this like super flat state, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to put that back on. A lot of dirt bikers will throw like baby powder or something inside the tire, and what that does is when they air down their tires, it allows some like reduced friction between the tube and the tire itself, and so they can kind of move around independently when they have very little air in their tires. For a street bike, I usually don't worry too much about that because we're not airing down the tires, or we do potentially air down the tires a little bit, but we're not going down nearly as far as like a dirt biker or an off-road rider. So I just put it in. I don't kind of worry too much about where it is. If you look on your tire and you see, a red dot. So Pirelli uses red dots. Some companies use like a yellow dot. That typically denotes like the heavy side of the tire or where the valve stem goes. So typically a red dot is where you put your valve stem. Sometimes a white dot means it's the heavy side, so you want to put that on the opposite side of your tire. It just really depends. It'd be nice if they did all the same stuff. So here, I'm just going to air up the tube. And while I'm doing it, I'm just pushing it in so that matches it. And you can fill it up quite well. As you can see, it's lifting the whole thing up. And then we just let it out. And as it's coming in, I just keep pushing it. There it is. Alright. Alright, so I have the tube kind of like shaped into the rim after inflating and deflating it. Now, motorcycle tires are directional, so let's see if we can find it. There it is. So there's an arrow. This does say rear wheel, and this is a rear wheel. So what you want to do is, I'm going to use this as an example. Look at the bike. Now, this is the hub side because it has these rubber bumpers in there. Rubber bumper. What you want to do is look to see what side the chain is on. Imagine which way it's spinning. And then bring that over here and kind of keep your finger going in the same direction and make sure the arrow is going the same direction as your finger. At least that's how I do it. I have put tires on backwards more times than I can count. And it's always a pain in the butt because then you have to turn it around. So just double check. Arrow right there is pointing this way. That's the way my finger was pointing the last time. So now I can just put it back on. For this, we will be using tire lube. And you just gotta make it slippery so everything slides together really easily. So I'm just gonna spray, hopefully, there it goes, where the beads go, and then also like on the drop center, the little ramps that lead up to the beads, or the bead landings. Just spray all that so everything can kind of move nice and smooth, and work your way all the way around the rim. And it's kind of helpful because it's a bit chilly in here today. So this isn't going to dry too quickly. Again, I'm not a huge fan of this tire lube that I'm using. If you can look for like, it's called duck butter. Great name. You can buy it at like hardware stores and stuff like that in a smaller tub. It's rubber lube for putting like rubber ends on pipes and stuff. It works really, really well. It's water-based. It's easy to wash off. I prefer to use that. I ran out. I don't have any. I got a bottle of this, and I've been using it, and it's just okay. So the wheel is all lubed up. Now we're just going to do the tire as well. So I'm kind of liberal with it. Not too... I don't want to use a whole lot, but I also don't want to be like stingy with it. Just work it all around the brim, or all around the bead. And you do also, so I work it all around the beads, and then I work it on the inside of the tire, so I'm like up inside. With that, it just kind of helps create an ease for it to come around the rim on the outside. It, you know, keeps everything nice and slippery, and just make sure it's all where it's supposed to be. And then before we put it on, make sure it's in the right rotation. Now this is a tube tire again. There it is. So I'm gonna bring the valve stem hole so it's in that rim itself. I put it right in front of me, sink down the tire closest to me, and then insert the valve stem into that hole. Now with tube tires, they come with these little nuts on them to hold the valve stem to the rim. So what I'll do is take that top nut and just thread it on a few turns, like till it's even with the valve stem itself. This creates a little bit of space for it to kind of wiggle around and go where it needs to go. If you tighten it all the way down right away, a lot of times what you're going to do is actually pinch the tire, especially in this area nearest to the valve stem, just because it doesn't have any flexibility and you can't really get in your irons without like poking through that tube itself. So that's all set. Kind of pull it close, hold this side down with my knee. Take one of my big irons, and I'm starting at like, I don't know, what is that, 8 o'clock or so? And I'll put this one up here. So I'm gonna need to create a bit of tension, and I'm just using this as like a ramp, and I'm pushing more with my hand than I am with the iron. You're gonna hit a spot, like a point where you can't do that anymore. So then I just use the iron and lever it over that rim. So we do have to keep that there, otherwise it's just gonna pop back up. So I'm gonna grab my second one and carefully insert it between the reel and the bead. And again, I'm really only working in like 4 or 6 inch like bites on that bead. So I got pressure on this one. I'm gonna start bringing this one around, and it can be a little helpful if you wiggle. I'm gonna have to move a little bit closer. This one, it's cold and it's stiff. It doesn't want to go on as much. There it is. So then once that one has the tension and the bead has gone over the rim, you can remove the first one, and it's virtually the same thing. Get it underneath without scratching anything. I'm gonna bring it close again and push. There it goes. You can feel it when it starts to drop across. Just gonna check that tube, make sure it's not poking out anywhere. And let's see if we can get the first bead. So that first bead we're dropping down is on the bottom, and sometimes, there it is. You can get it really close, so there's maybe about that much remaining and then an arc. Usually that first bead will drop over quite easily because the tire's still really, really flexible. Now when you're doing this top bead, you do have to work a little bit slower for 2 reasons. One, this is tubed and I don't want to pinch the tube by ramming my tire iron in there. And the other side of things is there's steel inside the belt, or not the belt, the bead. And if you're really putting a lot of effort into it and forcing it in, what you're gonna find is that you'll start hearing some steel snapping, and that's the steel cable that's basically inside that bead, and you don't want to do that. A little bit of it is okay, but if you start really trying to lever too much of the tire at once, and it's really, really difficult, then you can actually damage the integrity of the tire. And considering motorcycles only have 2 tires on the ground, you don't want to damage that integrity. So we're just going to do the same thing for this top bead. For this, I'm going to probably use all 3 of these now. So I got the big one, 2 big ones, and the third one is that little small one. So I like to start at the valve stem. It just feels safer to me. Use 1 iron, push it down a little bit. I'm not really trying to sneak it underneath or anything like that, sneak the bead onto the rim already. I'm just using this to kind of keep it down. You know what? We're gonna switch over to the little one for this spot because I want to use the big ones. There. So the little one is gonna be here for holding the bead right here. This little iron is probably gonna stay in this spot the entire time I'm putting this rim on, or the tire on the rim. This is just used to keep an anchor right here. It's basically a bead buddy, and they do make tools that do this as well. I travel around and change tires, and I find just having 2 big irons and a little iron works really, really well. The big ones are for your leverage. So I got that one in there. I'm just gonna kind of put my knee across it, and that just helps me hold it in place. Now remember, this is a tube tire, so I want to be really careful with my iron and not pinch that tube while I'm doing this. So I just kind of work it down. The first few of these are going to be really, really easy, and you can probably take kind of big bites. When you're doing that top one, so this top bead, you kind of start big, and then you start shrinking the bites down on the where you're putting your levers. So you start getting closer to your levers, and you just slowly ease that bead over the rim. I do like to reach inside and make sure that tube is out of the way. I just want to make sure I'm not pinching it. And another thing you can do if you're working with tube tires is don't go all the way down with it. If you do happen to catch the tube underneath that little hook, if you go all the way down, it's going to push it into the rim and put a little hole in it. Where for this, if I just kind of go 3/4, maybe add a little hand pressure, or we'll just use that one. There. So I like to keep my other iron kind of in this space. That kind of helps prevent, in the event that I do catch that tube, I'm not going to hopefully pinch it. So here it's still going pretty easy. Slowly work it in. So I can feel the tension slowly coming around to that little iron that's underneath my knee. And basically that's the bead itself trying to walk its way behind my iron. So when you're putting them back on, it's gonna try to basically keep a certain amount of that bead above the rim. This little iron that's right here between my knees, what that's gonna do is lock it in here so it can't keep walking itself behind my iron, so it would slowly follow. So at this point, I only have a little bit left right here, but if I look over here, this tire is actually into the beads. So the bead is kind of currently set, which makes this even more difficult because it doesn't give it any space to work. Like any space to, it doesn't give it any slack. So I'm just gonna take my other iron and work backwards a little bit and just sink the bead back into the drop center. So there. So it's falling back down, there's a space in here again. It creates a bit more slack in the bead to allow me to work that bead all the way around. So here, just keep going. In truth, I probably change a couple hundred tires a year. And the best tip I can give you is if it's being really difficult, depending on the tire, if it's really hard, take smaller bites of that bead, trying to sink it back over. Work really close together with your irons and just slowly inch it around. And that's what I'm doing now that it's getting closer and closer to where I started. It's just, it does take some muscle to do this, but also it shouldn't be like on the limit of a lot of people's ability. I've taught friends how to do this, and it's not the hardest thing to do. Once you kind of get the flow of it down, it does take some practice. So right there, you might have noticed what I did is I eased up pressure on this iron. And the only reason I did that is to ease up kind of the pressure underneath the tire against the rim so I can get this iron in without like dragging that hook over the edge of the rim. And if you do that, you're going to scratch stuff. All right, so we almost have the top bead all the way onto the wheel. So you can see that's the iron that's kind of currently holding the bead down right there. I got my little one right here that's holding this end down. So it's just this little bit. It's like, I don't know, a quarter of it basically. So at this point, to keep yourself from scratching this rim, what you can do is kind of let the, bring the iron backwards a little bit. So I'm kind of bringing it towards the center and easing up the pressure on that bead right there. And what that'll do is it'll create a bit more space under here so you can get the hook of this iron under the tire and above the rim and hook onto that rim, like the rim line, without kind of like scratching it. Now you can see, well, yeah. So whoever did this before did definitely get some scratches on there. There's some dings right here as well. I don't want to add any more to it, so this is how I do it pretty much on every rim. You can buy rim protectors, and they are really useful. I find they can be super annoying as well. As soon as they start to kind of warp and soften a little bit, they're just super annoying. So I just kind of developed this process for myself. But it's going to continue working this all the way around. And that last little bit, probably like right here, it's pretty much just one iron, keep pushing it over and over and over and over, and it'll just kind of slowly pull that bead underneath. And once it drops over, then we can inflate the tube and seat the bead. Bring you there. So just still slowly working. Now, there it is. So I'm getting really close to over here. This little iron's still holding that bead down. So now I'm gonna start bringing my irons closer and closer together every time I do this. And to do that, again, I'm gonna ease up the pressure that's on the furthest away iron so that it eases up some of the pressure under here. And I can get this second iron in. And as you can see, there's still plenty of like movement for that. And then this is kind of like a 1-2 again. So make sure that first iron's set, as I start bringing it around. So it's at like vertical right now. I'm gonna follow in behind with that second one. So I'm just kind of keeping pace with each other. And eventually you'll get this one about vertical. This one is now free. Keep pressure on this one, because otherwise it's gonna try to snap back. Get this iron ready. And same thing as last time. I'm gonna ease up that bead right here. Create a bit more space. And with this, it should get it to a point where this iron's gonna finish this whole side out. So again, one about to vertical, start following in with the second one, and it's going pretty easy right now. This one's about vertical. I can bring that one out. So there's just like about that much of that tire that's still above the rim. I'm just gonna use this single iron, bring it all the way over, and push. So I'm just gonna keep pushing and kind of hold it there. Maybe work it in a little bit. Let's get this first little one in there as well. So now I'm just pushing them both down and just watching. You'll see it's starting to slowly slip underneath. You don't need to force it. Is if it's moving, if it's starting to like suck itself underneath, just let it do its thing and it will take care of itself for you. All right. So, get everything out of the way. Moment of truth. Tighten this down a little bit so I can get my air chuck on there. Before I do this, I'm gonna double check I still got the right rotation on the tire. It is, thankfully. Hook up my air chuck and start inflating. There's one bead pop. There's two bead pops. Tube tires do seat a lot faster because they don't use the beads like landing on the wheel to hold the pressure into the tire itself. So it does require a little bit more effort and a little bit more pressure to seat a tubeless tire. But I'm just gonna inflate it up to about 40 psi and then grab something bubbly. So anything, it doesn't really matter too much what it is. This is just a cleaner that I'll wash off after this. And what I'm gonna do is spray around like the spoke holes and then around the rim itself. And I'm looking for bubbles. If there's any bubbles at this point, what it can mean is I also punctured the tube. Alright. Now something you might notice when you're doing tubed tires, again a lot of this is in relation to tubes. If you spray this right away after it seats, you might see some bubbles coming out around like the valve stem or around like some of the spoke holes. Give it a second. That tube that's inside had to displace some air as it reinflated and filled the inside of the tire and the wheel. And a lot of times those bubbles are just like the displaced air that was already in there. So usually what I'll do is I'll spray if I happen to have any bubbles coming out, and usually you're gonna see it around the valve stem itself. I'll give it a second, a minute or so, maybe not a minute, but I'll, give it a minute and see if it's slowing down at all. If it is, then it just means that displaced air coming out. If it's a big stream of bubbles and bigger bubbles showing up, usually that means you punctured the tube. And I got nothing. Yay! Alright, so the wheel is seated onto the rim, tube isn't leaking, which is awesome. I did inflate this without putting the valve core back in. It makes it easier to seat tubeless tires if you don't put the valve core back in. It allows a higher volume of air to punch into the tire when you first start airing it up. The valve core itself, they're not very big, they don't let a whole lot of air go through them, so you might find it's a little difficult to seat a tubeless tire. I just do it for everything. Take the core out and find my little tool, put this back in. There we go. So now we just have to reinflate and set to whatever pressure you're running it at. So I'm gonna set this to like, I don't know, 34 probably. Da-na-na-na. And a little bit more. There. Okay. So it's set to pressure. Usually what I'll do is spray the valve core itself. Just a little spritz. And that is to make sure that the valve core is sealing. It can suck when you put everything together, you put that together, put it all back on, go for a ride, everything's awesome, and then the next day the tire's flat. Usually if it takes that long to kind of go, then it's a tiny little leak. You might have a tiny little hole in the tube if you have tube tires. For a tubeless, it's either going to be the valve core or the valve, like the valve that's coming through the rim itself. They're usually like a rubber. If you happen to catch it, then it's probably leaking through that. So just spray around and see where the bubbles are coming from. A lot of times the valve core just wasn't super tight. So I make sure to give it a decent amount of like finger tension when I'm tightening it down. If I find it's going flat again, I'm gonna double check it, spray it, figure that out. You can buy new valve cores if you happen to have a bad one. If you don't get a bad one and it's still leaking, you might have to replace the tube or the valve in the tire. You don't have to replace tubeless valves every time. A lot of people do. It's not a bad idea too, but in reality, they last quite a long time. So that is how I change tires. I've changed a lot of tires before in just garages on the side of the road. Having some tire irons is really all it takes, and patience. Once you do this a few times, it does get easier and a little less, requires less muscle. You develop a flow and it just starts to work itself together better. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to leave them in the comments. I am still trying to grow my channel, and it would be awesome if you could leave a like and subscribe. I will have more videos slowly coming up. I do have plans and everything like that for more stuff to post. So that'll be up pretty soon as I start to record them. I will be getting some better equipment. Right now I'm just using my phone, and I know that's not the best thing in the world, but I will get some better equipment so everything's a little bit better. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Bye. So I did mention earlier that there's a tool to help you break beads that is super awesome actually. So it's the Bead Buster XB455. It's just this tiny little tool and it works fantastic. If you're going to be changing a lot of tires at home and you don't want to buy a stand or anything like that, this does a lot of the hard work for you by just breaking the bead, especially on those big fat like cruiser tires and stuff like that. It works really easily. They have really good instructions. You just hook it onto the rim, you screw this thing down, and that kind of locks it on there. And then you just use this big screw in the back. So this one right here, and that will drive a little foot that's right here on the bottom down, and it just sinks the bead for you. You can use a ratchet on it, you can use a wrench. I usually use my little impact gun for it. Just be mindful of the screw, they're not really impact related. Excellent tool. One of my shop mates bought it, and it's been a valuable addition to the shop whenever we're doing tires. I do recommend it. They are about 90 bucks. But if you do enough tires, it's definitely worth it. So check it out.